Sometimes the greatest act of service comes not from following orders, but from having the courage to break them. In a world where uniforms represent authority and silence often equals survival, one woman discovered that her conscience carried more weight than her badge. This is the story of Detective Sarah Martinez, whose refusal to look the other way cost her everything she had worked for, and gave her something far more valuable in return. What happens when doing the right thing means losing the career you've dedicated your life to? What price are you willing to pay when your integrity collides head-on with institutional corruption? Sarah Martinez thought she knew the answers to these questions. She was wrong. But in being wrong about the cost, she discovered something remarkable about the true meaning of courage, justice, and what it really means to serve and protect. Her story begins on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning in downtown Phoenix, where a routine drug bust was about to uncover a web of corruption that reached into the highest levels of the police department. It ends with a woman stripped of her badge, but not her dignity, removed from duty, but not from purpose, silenced by the system, but speaking louder than ever before. Detective Sarah Martinez had always believed that the badge on her chest meant something. For 12 years, she wore it with pride, polished it every morning before her shift, and never questioned what it represented. Justice, protection, truth. These weren't just words printed in the department handbook. They were the principles that guided every decision she made on the streets of Phoenix. The rain that Tuesday morning in March seemed to wash the city clean, but Sarah would soon discover that some stains run too deep to be cleansed by weather. She sat in her unmarked sedan outside the Meridian apartment complex, watching water cascade down her windshield as she waited for her partner, Detective Mike Rodriguez, to finish his coffee and cigarette. The call had come in at 6:47 a.m., a tip about a major drug operation in apartment 4B. Anonymous caller, probably a neighbor tired of the constant traffic in and out of the building. Sarah checked her service weapon one more time, a habit she developed after a close call 3 years earlier when a domestic dispute had turned into a hostage situation. She'd learned that in police work, preparation wasn't just about following protocol. It was about coming home alive at the end of your shift. But as she holstered her gun that morning, she had no idea that the real danger wouldn't come from the criminals they were about to arrest. Rodriguez flicked his cigarette into the gutter and climbed into the passenger seat, bringing with him the familiar smell of tobacco and cheap cologne. He'd been her partner for 8 months, transferred in from the narcotics division after what the department called a reorganization. Sarah had never asked too many questions about the transfer. Cops moved around all the time, and everyone had their reasons for wanting change of scenery. "Ready to bust some heads?" Rodriguez asked, checking his own weapon with practiced efficiency. There was something in his voice that Sarah couldn't quite identify, an edge that seemed sharper than usual, a confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Let's just do this by the book," Sarah replied, starting the engine. She'd said the same thing before every operation for 12 years. The book was her Bible, procedure was her religion, and proper police work was her calling. She believed in the system because the system had never given her a reason not to. They made their way up the narrow stairwell of the apartment building, past walls covered in graffiti and doors that had seen better decades. The smell of mildew and something indefinable hung in the air. Sarah had been in hundreds of buildings like this one, places where hope went to die and dreams got buried under layers of poverty and neglect. But she'd also seen these places transform when the right intervention came at the right time. Apartment 4B sat at the end of a dimly lit hallway. Sarah positioned herself on one side of the door while Rodriguez took the other. This was the moment she lived for, the culmination of investigation, the point where speculation became action and suspicion became evidence. She raised her hand, ready to knock and announce their presence, when Rodriguez grabbed her wrist. "Wait," he whispered, pulling out his phone. "Let me make a call first." Sarah frowned. This wasn't protocol. They'd already coordinated with dispatch, backup was on standby, and the warrant was solid. "Mike, what are you doing?" Rodriguez held up a finger for silence and turned away, speaking in low tones into his phone. Sarah couldn't make out the words, but she caught fragments, something about the package and cleaning up loose ends. A cold feeling began to settle in her stomach, the kind of instinctive warning that good cops learn to trust. When Rodriguez finished his call, he turned back to Sarah with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Okay, let's do this. But, Sarah, when we get inside, let me do the talking. This might be more complicated than it looks. The first red flag was small enough to ignore. Sarah knocked on the door and announced their presence, following procedure exactly as she'd been trained. Phoenix Police, we have a warrant to search these premises. The response from inside was immediate, scuffling sounds, raised voices, and what sounded like items being moved quickly. When the door opened, Sarah expected to see the usual signs of a drug operation being hastily concealed. Instead, she found herself looking at Marcus Thompson, a 22-year-old community college student she recognized for volunteer work at the local youth center. Marcus wasn't a drug dealer. He was studying to become a social worker, the kind of young man who spent his weekends teaching kids to play basketball instead of running the streets. Marcus. Sarah's confusion was evident in her voice. What are you doing here? Before Marcus could answer, Rodriguez pushed past Sarah and into the apartment, his hand already on his weapon. Where is it, Thompson? Don't make this harder than it has to be. Sarah followed her partner inside, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. The apartment was modest but clean, furnished with secondhand furniture and textbooks scattered across a small dining table. This wasn't a crack house or a drug den. This was someone's home, someone trying to build a better life. Where's what? Marcus asked, his voice shaking with confusion and fear. I don't understand what's happening. I was just studying for my sociology exam. Rodriguez moved through the apartment with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. He went directly to the kitchen, opened the cabinet under the sink, and pulled out a black duffel bag that Sarah was certain hadn't been there when they first entered. The bag was heavy, bulging with something that made a distinctive rustling sound when Rodriguez lifted it. Well, Rodriguez said, unzipping the bag to reveal several kilograms of what appeared to be cocaine, neatly packaged in clear plastic bags. Looks like we hit the jackpot, partner. Sarah stared at the drugs, then at Marcus, then back at the drugs. Something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. Marcus Thompson was many things: dedicated student, community volunteer, young man working 2 jobs to pay for school, but he was not a drug dealer. Sarah had known him for 3 years, had watched him mentor troubled kids, had seen him turn down opportunities to make easy money in favor of staying on a straight path. This isn't mine, Marcus said, backing against the wall with his hands raised. I've never seen that bag before in my life. Someone must have put it there. This is my apartment, but I don't do drugs, I don't sell drugs, I don't even drink alcohol. Rodriguez was already reaching for his handcuffs, but Sarah held up her hand. Wait a minute, Mike. Something's not right here. What's not right is that we found a major stash in this punk's apartment, Rodriguez replied, his voice growing harder. Open and shut case, Sarah. Let's bag him and get out of here. But Sarah's instincts were screaming now. She looked around the apartment more carefully, noting details that told a story very different from the one the drug suggested. The refrigerator was covered with academic achievement certificates and photos of Marcus with local kids at community events. His course schedule was taped to the wall, showing a full load of challenging classes. His bank statements, visible on the counter, showed the modest income of someone working part-time jobs and living paycheck to paycheck. Marcus, Sarah said gently, I need you to think carefully. Has anyone else been in your apartment recently? Anyone with a key? Anyone who might have had access? Before Marcus could answer, Rodriguez stepped between them. Sarah, what are you doing? The evidence speaks for itself. Let's just do our job and get out of here. There was an urgency in Rodriguez's voice that Sarah had never heard before, and it made her more suspicious rather than less. Good police work required asking questions, gathering all the facts, and following the evidence wherever it led. But Rodriguez seemed determined to avoid any investigation beyond the surface level. Our job is to find the truth, Sarah replied. her voice firm. And something about this doesn't add up. She began examining the kitchen more closely, looking for signs that someone other than Marcus had been there recently. The cabinet under the sink showed fresh scratches around the hinges, as if it had been opened and closed repeatedly by someone unfamiliar with its quirks. The dust pattern on the shelf where the bag had been placed was inconsistent with the rest of the cabinet's contents. "Mike," Sarah said slowly, "how did you know to look in that specific cabinet?" Rodriguez froze for just a moment, barely a heartbeat, but long enough for Sarah to notice. "Lucky guess," he said. "That's where they always hide the stuff." But Sarah knew that wasn't true. In her 12 years of experience, drug dealers hid their stash in dozens of different places: bedroom closets, bathroom tanks, ceiling tiles, inside appliances. There was no standard hiding spot, no universal location that cops always checked first. The fact that Rodriguez had gone directly to the correct cabinet suggested knowledge that he shouldn't have had. As Sarah processed this information, her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop asking questions if you know what's good for you." The message was sent at the exact moment she'd started questioning Rodriguez about the cabinet. Someone was watching, someone was listening, and someone wanted this investigation to end quickly and quietly. Sarah looked at Marcus, who was now sitting on his couch with his head in his hands, and then at Rodriguez, who was growing more agitated by the minute. She thought about the text message, about the convenient location of the drugs, about her partner's strange behavior, and about everything she'd learned in 12 years of police work. The truth was becoming clear, and it was more disturbing than any crime she'd ever investigated. This wasn't just a drug bust. This was a setup. Someone had planted evidence in Marcus Thompson's apartment. Someone had made sure Rodriguez knew exactly where to find it. And someone was now threatening her to keep quiet about what she'd observed. Sarah Martinez had spent her entire career believing in the system, trusting in the integrity of her fellow officers, and following the rules that were supposed to ensure justice for everyone. But as she stood in that small apartment, watching an innocent young man face charges for crimes he didn't commit, she realized that the greatest threat to justice sometimes came from within the very institution sworn to protect it. The badge on her chest suddenly felt heavier than it ever had before. The decision she was about to make would determine not just the fate of Marcus Thompson, but the future of her own career and everything she'd worked to build. She could follow Rodriguez's lead, close her eyes to the obvious inconsistencies, and go home that night with her job intact and her conscience buried. Or she could do what she'd sworn to do 12 years earlier when she raised her right hand and took the oath to serve and protect. She could follow the evidence, ask the hard questions, and stand up for the truth, even if it meant standing alone. Sarah Martinez looked at her partner, looked at the young man whose life hung in the balance, and made the choice that would change everything. "Mike," she said, her voice steady despite the fear growing in her chest, "I think we need to call internal affairs." Rodriguez's face went white, then red, then something close to murderous. "Sarah, don't do something you'll regret. Think about your career. Think about your pension. Think about everything you'll lose." But Sarah was thinking about something else entirely. She was thinking about a 22-year-old student who volunteered at youth centers and worked 2 jobs to pay for school. She was thinking about the oath she'd taken and the badge she wore. She was thinking about the difference between being a cop and being a police officer. The difference, she realized, was courage. And courage, it turned out, was about to cost her everything. The Internal Affairs office occupied the 3rd floor of the Phoenix Police Department headquarters, a place most cops avoided unless they absolutely had to be there. Sarah Martinez had never set foot in that office during her 12 years on the force, never imagined she'd have a reason to. Now, as she sat across from Detective Lieutenant Patricia Walsh, she wondered if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. Lieutenant Walsh was a 25-year veteran with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that had seen every kind of corruption the department had to offer. She listened without interruption as Sarah recounted the events at the Meridian apartment complex, taking notes in precise handwriting and occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Walsh said after Sarah finished her account. "You're alleging that your partner, Detective Rodriguez, planted evidence in Marcus Thompson's apartment and had prior knowledge of where the drugs would be found." Sarah nodded, though the words sounded almost unbelievable when spoken aloud. "I know how it sounds, Lieutenant, but I've been a cop for 12 years, and I know the difference between a legitimate bust and a setup. Everything about this was wrong." Walsh leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with an expression that revealed nothing. "These are serious allegations, Detective Martinez. Do you understand that if you're wrong, you could be looking at disciplinary action for filing a false report against a fellow officer?" "I understand," Sarah replied. "But if I'm right, an innocent man is sitting in jail, and there's corruption in our department that goes beyond just one bad cop." The next few days passed in a blur of interviews, polygraph tests, and paperwork. Sarah found herself under more scrutiny than the criminals she usually investigated. Her phone records were examined, her financial history was reviewed, and her psychological fitness for duty was questioned. The message was clear: when you accuse a fellow officer of corruption, you become the subject of investigation. Meanwhile, Marcus Thompson sat in county jail, unable to make bail on drug trafficking charges that could send him to prison for decades. His dreams of becoming a social worker were on hold, his reputation in the community was destroyed, and his family was struggling to understand how their son could have been involved in something so completely contrary to everything they knew about him. Sarah visited Marcus in jail 3 days after his arrest, sitting across from him in the sterile visiting room and seeing the impact that the charges had already had on him. The confident young man who volunteered at youth centers had been replaced by someone who looked defeated, confused, and abandoned by the system he'd always trusted to protect the innocent. "Detective Martinez," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, "can you tell me why this is happening? I keep trying to understand, but nothing makes sense. Those drugs weren't mine. I've never even seen that much cocaine in my life." Sarah wanted to reassure him, wanted to promise that justice would prevail and the truth would come out. But she'd been a cop long enough to know that the system didn't always work the way it was supposed to. Sometimes the innocent suffered while the guilty walked free, and sometimes doing the right thing made you more enemies than friends. "I believe you, Marcus," Sarah said, "and I'm doing everything I can to prove your innocence. But I need you to help me. Think back over the past few weeks. Did anything unusual happen? Anyone asking questions about you? Anyone showing unexpected interest in your life?" Marcus thought for a long moment. Then his eyes widened with sudden realization. "There was this guy," he said. "About 2 weeks ago, he came to the youth center asking about volunteer opportunities. Said his name was Tony, claimed he wanted to give back to the community. But something about him felt off. Off how? He didn't seem genuinely interested in helping kids. He kept asking personal questions about the volunteers, wanted to know where we lived, what our schedules were like. And he was particularly interested in me for some reason. Asked about my apartment, my roommate situation, even asked if I lived alone." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. This was exactly the kind of preliminary surveillance that would precede a setup. Someone had been watching Marcus, learning his routine, and planning how to use him as a patsy for whatever illegal operation they were trying to protect. "Did you get a last name? Any contact information?" "He left a phone number, said he'd call about volunteering. But when I tried to call him a few days later to follow up, the number was disconnected." Sarah made notes of everything Marcus told her, but she knew that without more concrete evidence, his account wouldn't be enough to prove the setup. She needed to find Tony, needed to uncover the connection between him and Rodriguez, and needed to figure out who was really behind the drug operation that had been blamed on an innocent college student. Her investigation hit its first major breakthrough when she decided to dig deeper into Rodriguez's background. Using her access to departmental databases, she discovered that her partner's transfer from narcotics hadn't been voluntary. He'd been under investigation for excessive use of force and questionable arrest procedures, though the investigation had been closed without formal charges being filed. More disturbing was what she found when she looked at Rodriguez's recent cases. Over the past 8 months, he'd made more drug arrests than any other detective in the department, an impressive record that had earned him commendations and consideration for promotion. But when Sarah examined the cases more closely, she noticed a pattern that made her stomach turn. All of Rodriguez's major drug busts involved young men from the same demographic as Marcus Thompson, college students, community volunteers, people with no criminal history, and strong ties to local organizations. The arrests were always clean, with drugs found in obvious locations and no weapons or resistance involved. The suspects all claimed innocence. All insisted they'd never seen the drugs before, and all were represented by overworked public defenders who encouraged them to accept plea bargains rather than fight charges they couldn't afford to contest. Sarah realized she wasn't looking at the work of an exceptionally effective narcotics detective. She was looking at a systematic operation to frame innocent people for crimes they didn't commit, using their arrests to cover up a larger criminal enterprise that operated with impunity while scapegoats took the blame. The more she investigated, the more dangerous her situation became. Her car tires were slashed in the department parking garage. Her home address was spray-painted on a wall near the police station with a message that read, "Snitches get stitches." Her personal cell phone received calls at all hours from unknown numbers, sometimes with threats, sometimes just heavy breathing, always with the clear message that she was being watched. But the real pressure came from within the department itself. Sarah's supervisor, Captain James Morrison, called her into his office on a Friday afternoon and closed the door behind her with a finality that suggested this wasn't going to be a routine performance review. "Sarah," Morrison said, settling behind his desk with the weariness of a man who dealt with too many complicated situations over the years, "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Are you absolutely certain that you want to continue pursuing this investigation?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Marcus Thompson is innocent, and there's corruption in this department that needs to be exposed." Morrison sighed and opened a file folder on his desk, revealing what appeared to be Sarah's complete personnel record. "You've been an exemplary officer for 12 years. Commendations for bravery, community service awards, perfect attendance record. You're 3 years away from being eligible for early retirement with full benefits. Your pension is worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you've built a reputation as one of the most reliable detectives in the department." Sarah sensed the "but" coming before Morrison spoke it. But Morrison continued, "If you keep pushing this investigation, all of that goes away. Rodriguez has filed a counter-complaint alleging that you've been harassing him, creating a hostile work environment, and attempting to frame him for misconduct. Internal Affairs is now investigating you as thoroughly as they're investigating him." "Captain, with all due respect, the evidence clearly shows—" Morrison held up his hand. "Sarah, I'm not questioning your integrity or your judgment, but I'm telling you that this situation has gotten complicated in ways that go beyond a simple misconduct investigation. There are people in this department, people above my pay grade, who want this to go away quietly. Rodriguez has connections, he has friends in high places, and he has information that could be embarrassing to a lot of people if it came to light." Sarah felt the weight of what Morrison was telling her without actually saying it. The corruption didn't stop with Rodriguez. It went higher, much higher, and her investigation was threatening people with the power to destroy her career and possibly her life. "What are you asking me to do, Captain?" "I'm asking you to consider the possibility that Marcus Thompson takes a plea bargain for a reduced sentence. Rodriguez gets transferred to another division with a letter of reprimand in his file, and you go back to regular detective work with your career intact and your pension secure." Sarah stared at her supervisor, a man she'd respected and trusted for years, and realized that he was asking her to participate in a cover-up. He was asking her to abandon an innocent man to protect a corrupt system, to choose her personal financial security over her professional integrity, and to become complicit in the very corruption she'd sworn to fight against. "And if I refuse?" Morrison's expression grew pained. "Then you'll be suspended pending a full investigation of Rodriguez's countercomplaints." Your gun and badge will be confiscated, your access to departmental resources will be terminated, and you'll face departmental charges that could result in termination for cause, which would eliminate your pension benefits and make it nearly impossible for you to find work in law enforcement anywhere else. The choice was stark and brutal. Sarah could abandon Marcus Thompson and return to a comfortable career that would provide financial security for the rest of her life. Or she could continue fighting for an innocent man's freedom while sacrificing everything she'd worked for over the past 12 years. As Sarah sat in that office, looking at her personnel file spread across Morrison's desk, she thought about the young woman who'd joined the police force 12 years earlier. That woman had been idealistic, determined to make a difference, convinced that good cops could change the world one case at a time. She believed in justice, in truth, and in the power of the system to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. 12 years later, that idealistic young woman was being asked to choose between her principles and her livelihood, between doing what was right and doing what was safe, between serving justice and serving herself. Sarah Martinez looked at Captain Morrison and made her choice. "Understand the consequences, Captain," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "But I can't abandon Marcus Thompson, and I won't participate in covering up corruption. If standing up for the truth costs me my career, then that's a price I'm willing to pay." Morrison nodded sadly, as if he'd expected her answer, but hoped she might surprise him. "Then I'm afraid I have to ask for your gun and badge, Detective Martinez. You're suspended effective immediately, pending the outcome of the internal affairs investigation." Sarah unclipped her badge from her belt and placed it on Morrison's desk, then removed her service weapon and laid it beside the badge. The weight she'd carried for 12 years was suddenly gone, but instead of feeling lighter, she felt like she'd lost a part of herself. "Sarah," Morrison said as she reached for the door handle, "for what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. But doing the right thing doesn't always lead to the right outcome." As Sarah walked out of the police station for what might be the last time, she realized that Morrison was both right and wrong. Doing the right thing might not lead to the outcome she wanted, but it was leading to the outcome she could live with. And sometimes when the system fails, that's the only victory that matters. Her real fight was just beginning. Without her badge and gun, Sarah Martinez discovered what it meant to be truly alone in a fight for justice. The suspension from the Phoenix Police Department came with more than just the loss of her job. It came with the loss of her identity, her purpose, and the institutional support she'd relied on for 12 years. But it also came with something unexpected: clarity. For the first time in her career, Sarah wasn't bound by departmental politics, wasn't limited by bureaucratic procedures, and wasn't required to follow orders from supervisors who prioritized institutional protection over individual justice. She was free to pursue the truth wherever it led, even if that path took her in a dangerous territory that no badge could protect her from. Sarah's apartment became her command center, the dining room table covered with photocopied case files, printed emails, and handwritten notes connecting the dots between Rodriguez's suspicious arrests and the larger pattern of corruption she was beginning to uncover. Without access to official databases, she had to rely on public records, news reports, and the network of contacts she'd built during 12 years of police work. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Gonzalez, a paralegal at the public defender's office, called Sarah on a Thursday evening with information that changed everything. "Detective Martinez," Maria said, her voice nervous but determined, "I know you're not supposed to be working cases anymore, but I have something you need to see. It's about the Rodriguez arrests, and it's bigger than you think." They met at a coffee shop downtown, away from the courthouse and police station where their conversation might be overheard. Maria brought a file folder containing plea agreements from 17 different cases, all Rodriguez arrests, all involving young men with no criminal history, all resulting in guilty pleas for drug possession or trafficking charges. "What made you pull these files together?" Sarah asked, scanning through the documents. "It was the sentences," Maria replied. These guys are all getting unusually lenient sentences for the amounts of drugs they allegedly had. First-time offenders with kilos of cocaine getting probation and community service instead of prison time. That never happens unless there's something else going on. Sarah studied the plea agreements more closely and realized what Maria had discovered. The lenient sentences weren't acts of judicial mercy. They were evidence of a deal. Someone was ensuring that the scapegoats didn't spend enough time in prison to think too hard about their situations, to connect with other inmates who might help them understand what had really happened, or to develop the kind of anger that might motivate them to fight back against the system that had framed them. There's more, Maria continued, lowering her voice. I did some digging into the arresting officers on these cases. Rodriguez isn't working alone. There are 4 other detectives who've been involved in similar arrests, always finding drugs in convenient locations, always dealing with suspects who claim innocence, always resulting in quick plea bargains. Sarah felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a complete picture. This wasn't just about one corrupt cop planting evidence. This was about a coordinated operation that used false arrests to create cover for a much larger criminal enterprise. While innocent people were being framed for drug trafficking, the real traffickers were operating with impunity, protected by badges, and supported by a system that had been corrupted from within. The next step in Sarah's investigation required her to do something that went against every instinct she developed as a police officer. She had to work with criminals to catch other criminals. Through her contacts in the community, she arranged a meeting with David Chun, a former gang member who turned his life around and now worked as a community organizer in the neighborhoods most affected by drug violence. David met Sarah at a community center in South Phoenix, a place where former gang members, reformed addicts, and families affected by drug violence came together to try to heal their community. He was suspicious at first. Cops weren't generally welcome in these spaces, and a suspended cop asking questions about police corruption seemed like either a setup or a desperate attempt to cause trouble. But Sarah's reputation in the community preceded her. She'd worked dozens of cases in these neighborhoods, always treating victims and witnesses with respect, always following through on her promises, always remembering that behind every crime statistic was a human being deserving of dignity and protection. I've heard about what happened to you, David said as they sat in folding chairs in an empty meeting room. Word is you stood up for Marcus Thompson and got thrown under the bus for it. Marcus is innocent, Sarah replied, and he's not the only one. There are at least 17 other young men who've been framed for crimes they didn't commit, and I think you might know something about why. David was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah with eyes that had seen too much violence and betrayal to trust easily. Finally, he spoke. There's been talk on the street for months about cops who sell protection to dealers, he said. Not just looking the other way, but actively helping transport product, providing intelligence about other law enforcement operations, even eliminating competition by framing independent dealers or innocent people who might get in the way. Do you have names? I have better than names, David replied. I have photographs. David produced his phone and showed Sarah a series of photos taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. The images showed Rodriguez and 2 other men in police uniforms meeting with known drug dealers at various locations around the city. Money was changing hands, packages were being transferred, and in several photos, the cops were clearly providing security while drug transactions took place. How did you get these? Sarah asked. My little brother was killed in a drive-by shooting 2 years ago, David explained. The cops said it was gang violence, case closed, nothing they could do. But I knew it wasn't random. Miguel was trying to get out of that life, was going to testify against some dealers who'd been recruiting kids from his high school. Someone wanted him silenced, and someone with inside information knew exactly where to find him. David's voice carried the weight of grief and anger that had motivated him to spend months documenting police corruption, trying to gather enough evidence to prove that his brother's death wasn't just another statistic, but a murder orchestrated by the very people who were supposed to protect the community. I've been building a case for 2 years, David continued. Photos, video surveillance, financial records showing cops making deposits that don't match their salaries. I was planning to take it to the FBI, but I didn't know who I could trust. Then I heard about what you did for Marcus Thompson, and I realized maybe there's still some good cops left. Sarah looked at the photos and realized she was looking at evidence of a criminal conspiracy that went far beyond what she'd initially suspected. Rodriguez wasn't just a corrupt cop planting evidence. He was part of an organized criminal enterprise that used police badges to facilitate drug trafficking while eliminating competition through false arrests. David, this evidence could expose the whole operation and free Marcus Thompson and all the others. But it's also going to put you in serious danger. These people have killed before, and they won't hesitate to kill again to protect their operation. My brother is already dead, David replied. If I don't do something with this evidence, then Miguel died for nothing, and these bastards will keep destroying lives until someone stops them. Working with David's evidence and Maria's legal research, Sarah began building a case that she could take to federal authorities. The corruption was too extensive for the local system to handle. It would require federal intervention, witness protection, and a level of resources that only the FBI could provide. But before she could make contact with federal agents, Sarah's investigation took a dangerous turn. Someone had been monitoring her activities, tracking her movements, and preparing to silence her permanently. The threat came not through anonymous phone calls or spray-painted messages, but through a direct confrontation that nearly cost her life. Sarah was leaving the community center after a meeting with David when she noticed a car following her through the darkened streets of South Phoenix. She'd been trained to detect surveillance, and the sedan behind her was making no effort to conceal its presence. When she turned left, it turned left. When she accelerated, it kept pace. When she pulled into a gas station, it parked across the street and waited. Inside the gas station, Sarah called 911 and asked for police backup, then realized the absurdity of her situation. She was a suspended cop being stalked by people who might be connected to active duty officers. Any backup that arrived might be more dangerous than the threat she was trying to escape. Instead, she called David Chun, who arrived 20 minutes later with 3 other community organizers who'd served as informal security for neighborhood events. The sedan was gone by then, but the message was clear. Sarah was being watched, and her investigation was making powerful people nervous. "You can't go home tonight," David told her. "If they're willing to follow you in the open, they're planning something more direct. You need protection, and you need to get this evidence to people who can act on it before they find a way to silence you permanently." Sarah spent that night in a safe house provided by the community organization, surrounded by former gang members who'd turned their lives around and were now committed to protecting someone who was fighting for justice in their neighborhood. It was surreal, a suspended police officer being protected by the very community she'd been trained to view with suspicion, finding safety among people the system had written off as criminals or lost causes. The next morning, Sarah made contact with FBI agent Lisa Park, a federal investigator who specialized in police corruption cases. The meeting took place in a secure federal building downtown, where Sarah presented all the evidence she'd gathered: Rodriguez's suspicious arrest patterns, the lenient plea bargains, David's surveillance photos, and the testimonies of innocent people who'd been framed for crimes they didn't commit. Agent Park reviewed the evidence with the thoroughness of someone who'd seen too many corruption cases to be easily shocked, but even she seemed surprised by the scope of what Sarah had uncovered. "This is a RICO case," Park said finally. "Racketeering charges against an organized criminal enterprise that happens to include sworn law enforcement officers. If we can prove these charges, we're looking at federal prison sentences of 20 years or more for everyone involved." "What about Marcus Thompson and the others who were framed? If your evidence holds up in court, their convictions will be overturned and they'll be eligible for compensation from the city. But, Detective Martinez, you need to understand that testifying in this case will make you a target for the rest of your life. These people have already tried to intimidate you, and when they realize you're cooperating with federal authorities, the threats will escalate. Sarah thought about the choice she was facing: safety through silence or danger through truth-telling. She thought about Marcus Thompson sitting in jail for crimes he didn't commit, about David Chin's murdered brother, about 17 other young men whose lives had been destroyed by corruption that wore a badge and carried a gun. Agent Park, Sarah said, I didn't become a police officer to protect criminals who hide behind badges. I became a police officer to serve and protect innocent people. If that means putting my life on the line, then that's what I'll do. The federal investigation moved quickly once it began. Rodriguez and 4 other officers were arrested in coordinated raids, their homes and vehicles searched, their financial records subpoenaed. The evidence David Chun had gathered was corroborated by federal surveillance, wiretaps, and testimony from dealers who agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. Marcus Thompson was released from jail after 6 months of wrongful imprisonment. His charges dropped and his record expunged. The other 17 victims of the corruption scheme were similarly exonerated, though the damage to their lives, relationships, and futures couldn't be easily undone. Sarah Martinez never got her job back with the Phoenix Police Department. The internal affairs investigation concluded that while she'd been correct about the corruption, her methods of investigating it had violated departmental policy and undermined the chain of command. Her suspension became a termination, and her pension was forfeited. But Sarah discovered that losing her badge didn't mean losing her purpose. The FBI offered her a position as a consultant on police corruption cases, and she accepted a role that allowed her to travel around the country, helping other communities identify and root out corruption within their law enforcement agencies. 6 months after Rodriguez's conviction, Sarah received a call from Marcus Thompson. He'd returned to college, completed his degree in social work, and been accepted to graduate school. More importantly, he'd started a support group for people who'd been wrongfully convicted, using his experience to help others navigate the legal system and rebuild their lives after being betrayed by institutions they trusted. Detective Martinez, Marcus said during their phone conversation, I wanted you to know that what you did changed more than just my life. You showed me that courage isn't about wearing a badge or carrying a gun. Courage is about standing up for what's right even when it costs you everything you care about. Sarah smiled as she listened to Marcus's voice, strong and confident again, full of purpose and determination. She thought about the badge she'd worn for 12 years, the career she'd lost, and the pension she'd forfeited. Then she thought about the 17 innocent people who were now free, the community that was safer without corrupt cops, and the precedent that had been set for other officers who might face similar choices in the future. Her courage had spoken louder than her roster, louder than her badge, and louder than the institutional pressure to remain silent in the face of injustice. She'd lost her job, but she'd kept her integrity. She'd been removed from duty, but she'd stayed true to her duty to serve and protect. Sometimes the greatest act of service comes not from following orders, but from having the courage to break them when those orders conflict with the higher calling to defend truth, protect the innocent, and ensure that justice isn't just a word in a handbook, but a living principle worth sacrificing everything to preserve. Sarah Martinez had learned that courage isn't measured by the size of the badge you wear, but by the size of the stand you're willing to take when standing up means standing alone. And in the end, she discovered that her voice, the voice of one person willing to speak truth to power, could indeed speak louder than the silence of an entire system afraid to confront its own corruption.